Dear friends, welcome back to The Curious Case. It brings me real joy to share another quiet evening with you. Thank you for choosing this little corner of calm, where stories unfold softly and mysteries wait between the lines. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Settle in, breathe slow, and let the room grow still. Because something small tonight, a sound barely heard, will change everything. The village evening settled gently over street. Merry Mead, the kind of soft quiet that seemed to fold itself around the chimneys and gardens like a familiar shawl. Lamps glowed behind lace curtains. Kettles steamed. Somewhere down the lane a dog barked twice, then thought better of it and went silent again. It was an evening meant for small comforts, and Miss Marple knew it well. She sat by her window in her favourite chair, a sensible wool shawl over her shoulders, mending a small tear in one of her gloves. The thread slipped neatly through the needle. Her hands worked with steady calm, the sort of quiet rhythm she had always found soothing. Mending, after all, told its own stories. A worn patch, a loose seam, a stitch stretched too far. Every little flaw said something, if one had the patience to listen. Lucy, her maid, moved about the sitting room with soft steps, dusting the mantel, adjusting the cushion that never stayed where it should, tasking gently at the stubborn grate that refused to settle. "You'll have it perfect, Lucy," Miss Marple said without looking up. Lucy laughed under her breath. "I try, ma'am, though that cushion has a mind of its own." They shared a small smile. These small exchanges had become part of the house's natural heartbeat. Outside, the lane was unusually still. Only the faintest hint of movement reached them, the distant turn of a bicycle wheel, perhaps, or the flutter of a curtain caught by a passing breeze. Miss Marple paused her stitching, listening without appearing to. She often did. Habit, really. Years of noticing things most people let slip by. Lucy came to the window with a cloth in her hand. "Have you heard, ma'am, about Mr. Graves?" Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "The clockmaker?" "Yes, Mr. Lionel Graves. Always so proper. Always right on the mark, everyone says. And quite deservedly," Miss Marple murmured. "Mr. Lionel Graves, tall, neat, punctual to a fault, had tended the village clocks for years. Church clocks, mantel clocks, even the old brass carriage clock that lived on Miss Marple's sideboard. His reputation for perfect timekeeping was legendary. If one asked the time in Street Mary Mead, they didn't check a watch. They asked Mr. Graves. Lucy lowered her voice. "Well, his shop bell rang twice this afternoon." "That is not so unusual," Miss Marple said gently. "No, ma'am, but the shop was closed." The needle paused mid-stitch. Closed. Lights out. Curtains drawn. Yet the bell, according to Lucy, had rung. Not once. Twice. As if someone had entered. Or wished to. Miss Marple resumed her stitching, though her mind drifted quietly in another direction. Bells did not ring themselves. Not in shops. Not in workshops. Not in the tidy little world Mr. Graves maintained with such care. There was always a cause. A touch. A draught. A hand. "Perhaps a mistake," Miss Marple murmured. But even Lucy saw the faint crease of thought behind her eyes. The evening remained calm, the room warm, the glove nearly mended. Yet a tiny note of unease lingered, like a thread pulled just slightly too tight. But something felt slightly wrong. The evening had just settled into its gentle, familiar rhythm when a sudden knock sounded at Miss Marple's door. Not a firm knock, not a polite, measured one. A hurried, uneven tapping, as if someone's nerves had reached the door before they did. Lucy looked up from the mantel. "Who could that be at this hour, ma'am?" Miss Marple set down her mended glove and folded her hands calmly in her lap. "Let us see, my dear. Do open it." The door swung wide, and there stood young Peter Collins, the village errand boy, cheeks flushed from running and eyes wide with something like fear. His cap was crooked. His breath came in little bursts. He clutched the handle of his bicycle as though it might run off without him. "Miss Marple, please. May I come in?" "Of course, Peter. Close the door behind you. You look quite shaken." He stepped inside, The warm room seemed to steady him a little, but only a little. His fingers fussed with the brim of his cap. "It's Mr. Graves, ma'am. The clockmaker. I can't find him." Miss Marple exchanged a quick glance with Lucy before guiding Peter to a chair. "Start from the beginning, dear boy. Slowly now." Peter nodded, gulping air. "I was taking a parcel to his workshop, just after tea. The door was open, wide open. And that's odd, ma'am, isn't it? He always keeps. It's shut unless he's right there behind the counter." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "Very odd indeed." Peter continued, voice trembling. "And the lights were off. And he wasn't there. Not anywhere. I called his name. Twice. Nothing." Miss Marple folded her hands. "And the village is whispering already, I suppose?" Peter nodded miserably. "Mrs. Deering says she hasn't seen him since yesterday. Mr. Smythe said he heard someone moving about near the back gate, but he thought it was a cat." Lucy shook her head. "Poor Mr. Graves. So reliable. So careful." Peter leaned forward. "And that's the strangest part, ma'am. One of his clocks, the big brass one, was still ticking. Loud. But he's the only one who winds it. Always. And he never leaves it unwound or half done." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed very slightly. "A clock that should not tick by itself," she murmured. Peter nodded rapidly. "Yes, ma'am." It sounded wrong. Like it. Shouldn't be ticking at all. Miss Marple rose from her chair, with the calm precision of someone arranging her thoughts along with her steps. "Peter, did you notice anything else?" He hesitated. Only a smell." "What sort of smell?" "A strong one. Like polish, but sharper. Almost too much. As if someone spilled a whole bottle." Miss Marple paused at the hearth. "A workshop has many scents," she said quietly, almost to herself. "But an overdone scent, that is something else." Lucy frowned. "You think something's happened, ma'am?" Miss Marple didn't answer at once. She simply took her shawl from the back of her chair, folded it neatly around her shoulders, and picked up her walking stick. "Peter," she said softly, "you did the right thing coming here." The room fell still for a heartbeat, because Miss Marple knew. A clock that ticks alone, a door left open, a smell too strong, were never accidents. And that, small detail, changed everything. The lane outside Miss Marple's cottage held the kind of quiet that only comes when a village is thinking all at once. Doors half open, curtains lifted slightly, people pretending not to stare toward the workshop at the end of the road. Word travels differently in Street Mary Mead, soft, but certain. Miss Marple stepped out with her shawl snug around her shoulders, her steps steady, her thoughts steadier. Peter walked beside her, pushing his bicycle, still jittery from his discovery. Lucy remained behind, promising to keep the kettle warm for their return. The air felt cool, clean, with that faint scent of damp earth that always rose after sunset. But beneath it, Miss Marple sensed something else. Not danger, not fear, something quieter, something deliberate. They reached the bend where Peter had turned earlier. "Show me where you stopped, dear boy," she said gently. Peter pointed at a patch of flattened earth near the lamppost. "Here, ma'am. I braked too hard. See the skid?" Miss Marple nodded. "And your tracks continued toward the workshop?" "Yes, ma'am." She bent slowly, touching the edge of the mark with her fingertips. The soil was soft, crumbled easily, recently disturbed. Beside Peter's unmistakable tire lines, thin, neat, erratic at the end, there was another set, wider, heavier. "Peter," she murmured, "did anyone else pass you on the lane?" "No, ma'am, not a soul." She studied the second track, the angle, the pressure, the slight wobble at the turn. Not a child's bicycle, not a delivery cart, not a villager heading home. Someone had walked or wheeled something heavy along that lane. And recently, very recently, they continued toward the workshop. "Peter," Miss Marple said softly, "you mentioned the clock was ticking, the brass one." "Yes, ma'am." "And it was loud?" "Yes." Miss Marple folded her hands behind her back in that thoughtful way she had. And would you say the shop had been closed all afternoon? Peter nodded. Since morning, I think. Then why, she asked gently, would a clock be wound at all, if no one was there to wind it? Peter blinked. I didn't think of that. No, Miss Marple said kindly. Most people wouldn't. But clocks, you see, tell more than just the hour. They tell what someone wanted you to believe the hour should be. The workshop loomed ahead, quiet, dark, the sign swinging faintly in the breeze. The door still sat slightly ajar. Not broken, not forced, just open. In that unsettling way, something is open when a person meant to return and did not. Miss Marple paused at the threshold. Something glinted near her feet, a tiny fleck of metal, barely visible. She stooped and lifted it carefully, a brass screw, the kind used for tightening the casing of a clock, the kind that never fell out unless someone had been working and working recently. Peter frowned. Is it important, ma'am? Miss Marple tucked it gently into her glove. Everything is important, dear boy, especially the smallest things. She stood in the doorway, listening to the faint echo of the lone ticking clock inside. A steady, persistent beat. Odd. Wrong. Forced. Miss Marple no longer felt the cool calm of the evening. Something else now pressed lightly against the edges of her thoughts. A pattern, a question, a missing man, and a shop that should have been silent. She had seen enough to know things were not simple. Inspector Slack arrived with the same brisk annoyance he carried into most quiet village matters. His boots struck the lane a little too sharply. His coat swung with the determination of a man who already believed he knew the ending before hearing the beginning. He stopped outside the workshop, glanced at the open door, and sighed as though personally inconvenienced by the entire village. Well, he said, barely, looking at Peter. What's all this about Graves disappearing? Probably wandered off to visit his sister, or took ill and went home without telling anyone. Peter shrank under the tone. Miss Marple, however, remained as calm as a teapot on a steady flame. Inspector, she said gently, Mr. Graves is not one to wander, not without locking his shop, not without putting away his tools, and certainly not without winding his clocks. Slack waved a dismissive hand. People do odd things when tired, Miss Marple, or distracted. No crime here. We've had a burglary in Much Pennington now that is real work. He stepped past them into the workshop, muttering, villagers and their imaginations. Miss Marple followed quietly. She never argued. She simply observed. Inside, the ticking clock echoed through the dim room. A single rhythmic sound, almost too steady, too insistent. Slack glanced at it and scoffed. So, a clock is ticking. That's hardly a mystery. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the door. Inspector, may I point out one small thing? Slack sighed but nodded. Go on, then. The key, Miss Marple said softly, is still in the lock. Slack rolled his eyes. And, she continued, it is turned outward. Peter blinked. What does that mean, ma'am? Miss Marple touched the key gently with her gloved hand. If Mr. Graves had locked the door himself, from the inside, the key would be turned inward. Someone else, someone on the outside, turned it. Slack frowned. Could be nothing. A draft. A child. Anyone fiddling with it. Miss Marple said nothing, but her eyes moved slowly across the room, collecting pieces like threads, ready to be stitched into a pattern. The clock ticking. The strong scent of polish still hanging faintly in the air. The brass screw she found outside. The faint footprints leading to the workshop. The door left open without sign of force. The outward, key, tiny things. Each harmless, alone, together, another matter entirely. Inspector Slack, still unimpressed, headed to the counter. Well, until we know more, this is nothing but a missing person errand. And I don't have the manpower to chase after a clockmaker who's likely stepped out for a breath of air. He straightened his coat. Now, the Much Pennington burglary, that's the real trouble. Silver gone missing. Window smashed. Actual evidence. Miss Marple folded her hands. Of course, Inspector. Quite right. But her voice carried that soft, unmistakable note of thoughtful reserve, the kind that suggested she had already connected the first threads. Inspector Slack walked out of the workshop with irritation. Miss Marple walked out with quiet certainty, because she had seen enough. The clues were not loud, not dramatic, not shocking, but they aligned, quietly, purposefully, and that quiet alignment worried her, and the pattern was troubling. Morning in street, Mary Mead always carried the soft comfort of routine brooms, brushing doorsteps, teapots clinking, shop doors opening with their familiar creaks. But beneath the usual rhythm, a different note hummed now, a quiet curiosity, a wondering, a sense that something in the village had shifted overnight. Miss Marple stepped out after breakfast, shawl neatly pinned, gloves in hand, her steps steady and purposeful. She never rushed. Rushing, she often said, made the important things blur. Her first stop was Mrs. Deering's butter stall, set up as always beneath the elm at the corner. Mrs. Deering greeted her with warm cheer, but her eyes flicked nervously toward the clockmaker's lane. "You've heard, I suppose," she whispered, leaning over her butter scales. "A little," Miss Marple replied. "But I thought I might ask what you noticed." Mrs. Deering dabbed her forehead. "Well, it was odd, you see. Yesterday afternoon I passed by Mr. Graves's workshop. The door was locked, lights off, but the curtain, just the left one, moved. I'm sure it did. Only a twitch, but it moved." Miss Marple nodded gently. "A curtain rarely moves without a hand, or a draft, and drafts do not choose only one curtain." Mrs. Deering blinked at her, thoughtful now. No, I suppose they don't." Miss Marple thanked her kindly and walked on. Next came the post office, where old Mr. Smythe polished his spectacles with the same care Mr. Graves gave his clocks. He looked up as Miss Marple entered. "Morning. Miss Marple, you're out early. I thought I might ask if you'd seen anything unusual these past few days." Mr. Smythe frowned, searching his memory. "Well, 2 days ago, there was a stranger, tall man, dark coat, asked directions to the workshop, but when I told him, he just nodded and walked off. Didn't seem in any hurry." "Did he go toward the workshop?" "I couldn't say. I was sorting envelopes after that." Miss Marple smiled politely. Mr. Smythe never lied, but he often forgot the important bits. From there, she made her way to the grocer's shop, where Ruby, the grocer's daughter, stood stacking apples in a neat little pyramid. She looked up when Miss Marple approached, cheeks pink with a hint of nerves. "Ruby, dear," Miss Marple said softly, "were you anywhere near the workshop yesterday afternoon?" Ruby hesitated. Just a moment. But hesitation, Miss Marple knew, was its own language. I heard something," Ruby admitted. "A thud, loud, like someone dropped something heavy. Then, nothing. Just silence." "And where were you standing?" "At the back of the shop, ma'am, near the open window." "And you didn't see anything?" "No, ma'am. Nothing at all." But the flush on Ruby's cheeks deepened. Her eyes drifted too quickly to the floor, and she walked away before Miss Marple could ask more. Miss Marple didn't follow. She merely stepped outside, walked around the back of the grocer's shop, and paused by the workshop's back gate. And there, caught on the rough wood, she found it a few pale cloth fibers, snagged as if someone slipped through hurriedly. A simple thing, a domestic thing, but not meaningless. As she tucked the fibers into her glove, Miss Marple felt the familiar, quiet shift of understanding. Someone had lied. Poorly. And not just about what they heard. She now knew someone was hiding something. The morning sun had barely lifted its pale light across Street Mary Mead when Miss Marple returned to the workshop path. The village was still wiping the sleep from its eyes, shutters opening, kettles boiling, doors unlocking. But she preferred these early hours. The earth spoke more clearly before too many footsteps muddied its story. She paused at the bend where Peter had skidded the day before. The soil remained soft, damp, marked with the same overlapping lines Peter's bicycle, tires, and beside them, the wider, heavier prints she had noticed earlier. Miss Marple leaned closer. The edges were crisp, untouched. No new tracks disturbed them overnight, meaning whoever had passed through had come before Peter, and no one had followed since. She continued down the path, her steps light, her cane gently tapping the earth. Ivy lining the workshop fence caught her attention. She brushed her fingers through the leaves. Some hung naturally, others sagged, crushed, brushed aside by someone taller than a child. Not broken, just disturbed. The kind of movement made by a person trying not to be seen. Miss Marple followed the subtle arc of bent ivy to the backyard. She retraced the steps as she imagined they had happened. A figure walking quickly, pausing at the gate, turning the key from the outside, slipping in, moving with caution. In her mind, she saw it clearly. Not a rush, not panic, but intention. She bent to study the soil near the back. Steps, tiny ridges, a faint heel mark, a small indentation where something heavy, perhaps a tool or bag, had been set down briefly. These quiet imprints told no lies. She stood there thoughtful when the soft rumble of wheels approached. Old Mr. Hudson, the milkman, came up the lane with his cart, humming a low, cheerful tune. When he spotted Miss Marple, he tipped his cap. "Morning, Miss Marple. Investigating, are we?" "Just observing, Mr. Hudson." He leaned on the cart handle. "Well, since you're asking around, I'll tell you one thing. Last night, just after closing time, I passed by here on my late round, and I could swear I saw a lantern burning inside that workshop." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her expression remained gentle. "A lantern? And the shop was closed?" "Closed tight," he said. "But the light was there, flickering, like someone was working late." Miss Marple folded her hands. "And did you see Mr. Graves?" "No, ma'am, but I didn't look long. Thought he'd just lost track of time." She thanked him with a warm nod and watched him disappear down the lane. Then she looked back at the workshop. A lantern burning after hours, a curtain moving behind a locked door, a ticking clock that shouldn't be ticking, a strong scent of polish lingering too long, a brass screw on the ground, footprints leading in, none leading out. Piece by piece, they now fit together. Not perfectly, but enough to suggest a shape, enough to suggest purpose and presence. The lane grew quiet again. Even the birds seemed to pause. Miss Marple lifted her gaze toward the path one more time, and suddenly she understood what it meant. And suddenly the road told its story. The workshop felt different when Miss Marple stepped inside again. The morning light slipped through the small front window in a thin, polite line, touching the dust on the counter and the rows of clocks arranged with Mr. Graves's usual care. Yet the air held a stillness that did not belong to morning or to any ordinary workday. She closed the door gently behind her. The ticking, steady, patient, unwavering, filled the quiet space like a single thought repeated over and over, dozens of clocks, each with its own rhythm, yet somehow keeping a shared, uneasy beat. Miss Marple moved slowly, eyes drifting across the shelves. Nothing seemed overturned, nothing broken, nothing out of place. And that, she knew, was its own kind of message. On the counter near the window stood a teacup, white porcelain, neat floral rim, still faintly scented with the memory of Earl Grey. Miss Marple leaned closer. Only a little liquid remained at the bottom, cooled long ago. But the important thing was not the tea. It was the single fingerprint smudge along the handle. Just one, heavy, clear, as if someone who did not normally drink tea here had lifted the cup and set it down again. Mr. Graves always used a cloth when holding his cup. Habit, precision, a clockmaker's instinct. He disliked smudges. They distracted him, he'd say. Miss Marple noted it quietly. She walked past the counter toward the wall of clocks, rows of polished faces, brass gleaming, wood frames shining. Every one of them read the same time, 7:45, except one. The small walnut clock hanging slightly above eye level, the one Mr. Graves cherished most, showed 7:12. Seconds ticked inside it, but the minute hand was still. Frozen. Miss Marple touched the frame lightly. The wood felt cool. "Only one," she murmured. "Only this one stopped." She studied the other clocks again. All ticking, all wound, all aligned. Someone had adjusted them. She stepped back, letting her eyes follow the small patterns. A cup used by the wrong hand. A clock stopped while the others ran. A lantern seen after closing. A curtain moved behind a locked door. And now, this. She imagined Mr. Graves in his workshop the previous evening. His precision. His habits. His comfort in the quiet tick of his clocks. The small routines that shaped his days. None of those routines included touching just one clock out of dozens, then leaving it frozen at the wrong time. No, someone else had touched it. Someone who didn't understand how carefully Mr. Graves kept his hours. Someone who wanted it to look ordinary, but didn't know the way his clocks truly behaved. Miss Marple folded her hands in front of her, the faintest crease forming at the edge of her expression. Someone had lied. Not loudly, not boldly. Quietly. In time, because altering clocks was not an act of panic, it was an act of intention. She looked around the workshop once more, letting the room settle into her understanding. The ordinary objects spoke clearly if you listened. A fingerprint, a frozen minute hand, a cup placed too neatly, a clock wound too late. Small things. Very small. Yet together, they formed a whisper of truth. Miss Marple stepped back toward the door, her shawl brushing lightly against the counter. She now knew this room had hosted two people last night. One belonged here, and one absolutely did not. Something in that house did not belong. Inspector Slack returned to the workshop with a scowl heavy enough to flatten the morning. His coat flapped behind him as though irritated too. Miss Marple stood quietly near the counter, hands folded, watching as he marched in with a notebook he clearly did not wish to use. "All right," he muttered. "We'll do this properly then, if only to stop people panicking over nothing." Miss Marple offered no argument. She simply stepped aside as Slack summoned each villager in turn one by one, like pieces on a board waiting to reveal their shape. Ruby arrived first, cheeks pink, fingers twisting the edge of her apron. Slack leaned forward. "Your time, Miss Ruby. When did you last hear from Mr. Graves?" Ruby swallowed. "Late afternoon, sir. Around 5:30. Miss Marple's eyebrow lifted. Ruby had told her something closer to 4 o'clock yesterday. A contradiction. Small, but sharp. Slack didn't notice. Miss Marple did. Next came Peter, the errand boy. He stood straight, trying to look brave, though his voice wavered. "I came by just before 6, sir. The door was open. The clock was ticking. And Mr. Graves wasn't there." Slack nodded, jotting it down. Miss Marple, however, noted the gap between Ruby's 5:30 and Peter's just before 6. A window of silence. Half an hour that felt suddenly important. Mrs. Deering followed, wiping her hands on her apron as though the truth needed polishing. "I saw the curtain move at about 4, she said firmly. Slack waved his pencil. "You're sure?" "As sure as I'm standing here." Miss Marple nodded politely. Yet she remembered Mrs. Deering's earlier mention of a shadow that didn't match the time of day. People often told the truth in pieces, she thought. Pieces that didn't always fit neatly. 3 people, 3 times, 3 small contradictions. Slack moved on. The stranger from the inn entered with a stiff nod. Tall, dark coat, polite but guarded. Slack asked, "And you, sir? You asked for directions 2 days ago?" The man nodded. "Yes, I collect antique clocks. I heard Mr. Graves repaired an heirloom piece recently. Did you meet him yesterday?" "No," the stranger replied calmly. "I never reached the shop in time." But Miss Marple watched him closely. He did not fidget. He did not avoid her gaze. Yet his boots carried traces of workshop soil, the same pale dust she had seen on the path. Not proof, but not coincidence. Slack grunted, closing his notebook. "Well, there it is. Nothing alarming. A few mixed times, But villagers are rarely precise. Miss Marple glanced at the stopped clock on the wall. 7:12. And the aligned clocks at 7:45. Two clocks, two timelines. Someone had lied about time. Not in words, but in hands of brass and wood. A motive began forming quietly in her mind. Mr. Graves had recently finished repairing a manor house's precious heirloom clock, the very piece rumoured to contain a gold inner casing. A rare thing, a tempting thing. Money, Miss Marple knew, could stir shadows in the most respectable homes, but still, pieces were missing. Footprints, curtains, times, clocks. It was close, but not clear. Miss Marple folded her hands softly. The picture was forming, just not complete, but the truth was still out of reach. Dusk settled over Street Mary Mead with a soft, rose-gold hush, the kind of quiet light that made chimneys blur and hedges soften into gentle silhouettes. Most villagers retreated indoors at this hour. Lamps were lit, curtains drawn, teapots filled. But Miss Marple preferred dusk. It was the hour when truth loosened its edges. She walked the lane alone, her shawl tight around her shoulders, her steps neither hurried nor hesitant. The workshop waited at the end still, dark, carrying the same faint question it had carried since yesterday. She pushed the door open with care. It gave a slow groan, as though reluctant to reveal anything more. The familiar scent greeted her again. Oil, wood dust, a trace of polish clinging stubbornly to the air. But beneath it, something softer, something faint, warmth. Miss Marple paused. Workshops did not stay warm at dusk, not in late evening, not after standing empty all day. She stepped inside, letting the ticking clock settle around her like quiet reminders. The teacup on the counter remained exactly where it had been that morning, cool, untouched, with that single fingerprint smudge still gracing its handle. A cold cup, a long-abandoned drink. A man who always finished his tea before returning to work. But Miss Marple was not here for the tea. She moved slowly toward the workbench at the back. The lantern hung beside. It, unlit now, its glass faintly smudged by a hand not accustomed to careful handling. She knelt beside the bench and then reached underneath, her fingers brushing lightly across the small wooden drawer built into the underside, a warming tray, neatly tucked beneath the work surface, the kind many craftsmen use to keep oils, small tools, and sometimes even tea warm during late-night work. She touched it gently. It was warm, faintly, delicately, but undeniably warm. Miss Marple did not gasp. She merely closed her eyes for a quiet moment, allowing the puzzle to settle into place. A cold teacup, but a warm tray. Mr. Graves had taken tea at 7. The teacup told her so. The coldness told her it had been left untouched for hours. But the warming tray. The tray spoke a different truth. Someone had been here after 7. Not briefly. Not in passing. Long enough to warm the tray. Long enough to search. Long enough to adjust clocks. Long enough to hide something. Or someone. Miss Marple opened the drawer fully. Inside, residue of warmed polish glistened faintly. Not spilled. Not fresh, but melted earlier than it should have been. She imagined the scene. Mr. Graves finishing his tea. A knock at the door. An argument, perhaps. Or a lure. A reason to step back inside the workshop after closing. Then, someone else staying longer than they claimed, later than they admitted, touching clocks they did not understand. Miss Marple stood and let her hand rest briefly on the workbench. A warm tray. A cold cup. A stopped clock, a stranger with dusty boots, Ruby's shifting times, and the faint whisper of polish on an evening breeze. Time, habit, object, click, everything aligned. With calm certainty, she turned toward the back of the workshop, her eyes clear now, her steps sure. She now knew exactly what happened. The back room of the workshop had always been Mr. Graves's private little sanctuary, a place of tools, careful repairs, soft lamplight, and the quiet, orderly world he built around gears and springs. Miss Marple stepped toward it with calm, deliberate steps, her hand brushing the doorframe lightly as she entered. The room greeted her with silence. No tools on the bench, no half-finished projects waiting patiently, no comforting scent of fresh wood shavings and warm oil. Yet the first clue lay right at her feet. A single wood shaving curled softly on the floorboards. Smooth, pale. It looked recent, the kind that fell when a craftsman adjusted a casing or trimmed a joint. Miss Marple picked it up gently and studied it under the last traces of dusk light filtering through the back window. This shaving did not belong to an ordinary clock. It was from the heirloom clock the manor house piece Mr. Graves had been repairing. She remembered its casing. Darker wood, trimmed, finely crafted, with inner compartments only a skilled hand could open. But the heirloom clock was not on the workbench. Miss Marple's eyes moved across every shelf, every hook, every small stand where the clock might rest. Nothing. The place where the heirloom clock should have been was empty, completely empty. She moved closer, bending slightly. The dust around the empty space had been disturbed, wiped, shifted, brushed aside. Someone had lifted the clock. Someone had removed it quietly. Not in panic. Not in haste. In intention. Miss Marple let her fingertips skim the smooth groove where the clock once Saturday. Then she turned slowly toward the far corner of the room, where a small, narrow door waited. A cellar door, barely noticed by most visitors, but not by her. The cellar door stood slightly open, not wide, not enough to call attention, just enough to suggest a hand had hesitated, or returned. She stepped closer, her cane tapping once against the floor. The first thing she saw was a scuff mark, a rough scrape across the wooden threshold, the kind made when something heavy scraped against it. The second was a drag mark, a faint, uneven track in the dust leading downward. Miss Marple knelt and touched the disturbed powder with her gloved hand. Someone had dragged something. No, someone had dragged someone, because the mark didn't curve like a lifted object. It dipped, rose, shifted slightly, as if the weight had changed from step to step. She straightened slowly, letting the room breathe around her. The pieces had grown too clear now to ignore. A missing clock, a missing man, a warm tray, a cold cup. A clock stopped at 7:12. Clocks forced to show 7:45. Footprints in the soil. Curtains moving behind a locked door. The cellar waited. Dark. Quiet. Holding whatever truth the village did not yet wish to face. Miss Marple touched the cellar handle gently. Her expression softened, sad, steady, certain. The truth had been whispering all along, and now it no longer whispered. Now it spoke. The clockmaker had not left at all. The cellar stairs creaked softly, beneath Miss Marple's feet. Not sharply, not dangerously, just with the modest protest of old wood, disturbed after too long a rest. She held the railing with one hand, her shawl gathered neatly with the other, and descended into the dim, cool quiet below the workshop. The air changed as she reached the bottom. Still, close, carrying a faint blend of earth, oil, and something else. Something metallic, almost like old brass warmed too long. Her eyes adjusted slowly. The lantern she carried cast a gentle circle of light around the cellar. Tools hung neatly along the wall just as they did upstairs. Shelves held boxes, cloths, and spare gears. Everything arranged with Mr. Elise. Graves's usual precision. Everything, except what lay at the far end of the room. There, against the old brick wall, stood the missing heirloom clock. Tall, beautiful, carved with intricate patterns, the kind of piece one saw only in manor houses or carefully preserved drawing rooms. But the moment Miss Marple saw it, she knew something was wrong. The clock door hung open. The inner casing, normally gold, was half exposed, as though someone had been trying to pry it loose. A fine scatter of wood dust lay on the floorboards nearby, identical to the shaving she had found upstairs. She stepped closer, slow, steady, quiet, and then she saw him. On the ground beside the clock, face down, motionless, lay Mr. Lionel Graves. Miss Marple knelt immediately, her hand hovering just above his shoulder before she gently touched him. The fabric of his coat was cool, his breath faint but steady, his pulse slow but present. Alive. Thank goodness. Alive. Not vanished. Not wandering. Not neglecting his clocks. Attacked. Miss Marple let out a soft breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She checked him carefully. No dramatic wounds, no visible injuries, but a tender swelling at the back of his head told its story plainly enough. He had been struck, hard enough to send him to the ground, hard enough to keep him there, but not hard enough to kill. Miss Marple stood and studied the scene. The open casing, the half-loosened fittings, the smear on the floor where someone had knelt, and the faint impression of a boot heel near the base of the clock far larger than Mr. Graves's own. The gold inner casing was the prize. Rare, valuable, the kind of thing that drew quiet greed out from well-shined corners. She imagined it now. Mr. Graves working late, a visitor arriving, a request perhaps, a question, a moment of trust broken by a sudden blow, the thief believing him dead or unconscious long enough, dragging him down here, planning to return, finishing the theft later, resetting the clocks upstairs to confuse the timeline. Each piece fit, each moment aligned, each small clue hummed with the quiet truth she had been collecting. Miss Marple lifted her lantern higher, letting its warm glow spread across the cellar room. Someone had basleesh, attacked Lionel Graves. Someone had tried to steal the gold casing. Someone confident enough to lie. Someone familiar enough to enter quietly. Someone desperate enough to return. But as she studied the cellar, the footprints, the disturbed dust, one question pressed more urgently than the rest. The truth was closer now, very close, but still covered by a thin layer of village silence. Miss Marple stepped back toward the stairs, her eyes calm, her thoughts firm. But who had done it, and why now? Morning light spilled gently across the grocer's shop windows, giving the apples a soft shine and the jars of barley a quiet glow. Street Mary Mead looked ordinary again, almost peaceful. But Miss Marple had long learned that peaceful mornings often followed nights weighed down by truths waiting to surface. She stepped into the shop with her usual warm nod. Ruby was behind the counter, arranging tins in a neat row, her movements quick, almost too quick. She looked up, startled, when she saw Miss Marple. "Oh, good morning, Miss Marple. Is there something you need?" Her voice was bright, too bright. Miss Marple smiled gently. "Yes, Ruby dear. Just a moment of your time, if you don't mind." Ruby hesitated, but politeness won. "Of course, ma'am." Miss Marple approached the counter with the calm of someone tidying her thoughts like folded linens. "You told Inspector Slack you heard the thud around 5:30, she said softly. "Yet yesterday, you told me it was nearer to 4. Ruby blinked. The tins rattled faintly in her hands. Perhaps I misremembered." "No," Miss Marple said kindly. "You did not." Ruby's shoulders stiffened. Miss Marple continued, her voice warm but steady. "You see, clocks can deceive. People can too. But habits rarely lie. Mr. Graves always drank his tea at 7. His cup was cold. His warming tray was warm. His clocks were altered. Someone was there. At a time they said they weren't." Ruby swallowed hard. A soft tremble passed through her fingers. "And the cloth fibers on the back gate," Miss Marple added quietly. "The same pale blue as your work apron." Ruby stared at the floor. Miss Marple stepped closer, her tone gentle. "Your father's debts are known, my dear. Not unkindly. Villagers hear things, whisper things, try to help when they can. But desperation, it pushes one into corners they never meant to touch." Ruby's eyes filled fear first, then the slow ache of truth. "I didn't mean to hurt him," she whispered. I only meant to take the casing. Just that small gold piece. I thought it would help Father. One good deed. Just one. To set things right." She pressed her hands to her face. "He surprised me. Came back for something he forgot. I panicked. I grabbed the nearest tool. I didn't think. He fell. I thought he was dead. Her voice broke. So I dragged him downstairs. Hid him. I was going to, I don't know, fetch a doctor later, but the whole thing terrified me. Miss Marple placed a hand lightly on Ruby's arm. Fear can do strange things, my dear, but you did not finish what you feared you started. Mr. Graves is alive. He will recover. The bell above the shop door jingled sharply. Inspector Slack stood there, notebook in hand, face grave. He had heard enough. He stepped forward, formal and stern but not unkind. "Ruby Collins," he said softly, "I'm afraid you must come with me." Ruby nodded, tearful, resigned. As Slack led her toward the door, Miss Marple remained still steady, rooted in the quiet truth that villages always revealed eventually. The shop felt too quiet, too still, too changed, for even in warm, gentle Street Mary Mead. But the village would never forget. The days that followed settled slowly across Street Mary Mead, like a soft quilt laid over a restless night. The village, so easily stirred by whispers, always found its way back to calm. And now, after the truth had surfaced, that calm returned little by little. Shops reopened, voices softened. Routine crept back into familiar corners. The grocer's bell rang with its usual cheerful chime. Mrs. Deering wrapped butter with her steady, comforting motions. Mr. Smythe resumed sorting letters with the precision of a man who believed the world could be repaired one envelope at a time. And at the end of the lane, the workshop door stood open, not in mystery now, but in invitation. Miss Marple visited one afternoon, a basket of scones on her arm. She stepped inside to find Mr. Lionel Graves seated beside his workbench, a wool blanket around his shoulders, Inspector Slack's stern advice still ringing faintly in his ears. But he was awake, smiling faintly, color returning, gratitude warming the room more than the small coal stove ever could. "Miss Marple," he said softly, adjusting his spectacles, "I owe you a debt I cannot repay." "Nonsense, Mr. Graves," she replied. "You owe me nothing at all. You simply needed someone to notice the little things. That is all." He chuckled weakly. "You always have been better with little things than most." Miss Marple placed her basket on the table and fussed slightly with the edge of the blanket, the kind gesture of someone who preferred her concern to speak quietly rather than loudly. "I thought," she said, "that you might enjoy a warm scone and some rest. Let the clocks wait a day or two. They can be patient." Mr. Graves looked at the row of clocks along the wall, each ticking at its own gentle pace, and nodded. "Patience," he murmured. "A lesson I should have learned sooner." He opened a small box beside him and held it out to her. "For you," he said, "a gift. A simple thing, but it belonged to my father, and it feels right that you should have it." Miss Marple opened the lid. Inside lay a small pocket, watch silver, smooth, with a delicate chain. The face was modest, the hands slender, the kind of object that carried stories not written anywhere except in the quiet corners of a life. She held it gently, feeling its weight, the lightness of metal, the heaviness of meaning. "Thank you," she said, her voice warm. "It's quite lovely." Mr. Graves nodded, eyes shining. "It keeps perfect time, better than any clock in this room. But after all this, I've realized perfect time isn't the same as a perfect moment." Miss Marple smiled. Outside, the afternoon sun brushed softly against the workshop window. The sense of oil, polish, and fresh scones mingled in a way that felt almost like forgiveness. The village had been shaken, but it had not broken. And Miss Marple, standing with the pocket watch resting lightly in her palm, understood the truth of it all, the quiet truth, the human truth. Moments matter, habits matter, small details matter, but truth arrives in its own time. And as she walked out of the workshop and onto the peaceful lane, one thought settled gently in her mind, warm as the scone in her basket, steady as the ticking watch in her hand. Truth, Miss Marple thought, cools slower than tea. And now, dear friends, it's Davis again. Thank you for staying with me through this quiet, winding mystery. The village has settled for the night, and the last embers in the hearth are softening into a gentle glow. Before we close our evening together, I keep thinking about two small things that changed everything: a stopped clock on the workshop wall, and a warming tray that should have been cold. Such simple objects, yet they carried the whole truth in their quiet way. Miss Marple always reminds us that the world doesn't shout its secrets, it whispers them. In habits, in routines, in the smallest things left behind on an ordinary day. Tell me, dear listeners, what clue stood out to you first? And which moment in the story surprised you the most? I always love reading your thoughts. They make these evenings feel shared, warm, and wonderfully human. Thank you for sitting with me tonight, in this little corner of calm. And, as always, as the tea cools, and the lamps dim, and the night folds softly around us, tomorrow another kettle will boil. And before we part for the night, a quiet whisper about what waits tomorrow. Imagine a wooden bridge, old and pale beneath the moonlight, the kind that creaks softly even when no one is crossing it. The village sleeps, yet something stirs. A midnight knock echoes against a lonely cottage door, gentle at first, then insistent, as though carrying a message meant only for the one brave enough to answer. And somewhere beyond that bridge, where the path narrows and the trees bend low, the wind uncovers a small shape hidden beneath damp leaves. A token, a clue, a truth left behind by someone who hoped no one would ever look closely enough. But Miss Marple will. She always does. Follow the sound tomorrow, the soft knock, the creak of the bridge, the rustle of leaves, for there, waiting quietly in the dark, lies the beginning of our next mystery. Before we slip into the quiet of the night, there's one last soft note to share. For those who listen with quiet hearts, these stories are made for you. Your presence, your thoughts, your gentle company, they shape every evening we spend together. The room grows still now. The lamplight settles, and from the corner of the kitchen, the kettle gives a small familiar hiss, as if reminding us that warmth is never far away. Thank you for sharing this moment, this calm, this simple pause in a busy world. Rest well, dear friends. Night settles quietly over Street Mary Mead. Miss Marple walks past the workshop window, her shawl gathered softly around her shoulders, her steps unhurried on the dim lane. Inside, a single clock glows faintly in the dark, its hands moving with calm certainty, its ticking the only sound in the stillness. The village rests, roofs dark, chimneys quiet, breathing in the peace returned. The clock ticks once more, soft, sure, and the scene gently fades into night.